The 1980s gave us a treasure chest of Saturday morning cartoons, but not all of them survived the test of time. Some were strange, controversial, or simply too bizarre for today's audiences. These forgotten shows pushed boundaries, embraced questionable humor, and reflected a world that has drastically changed. Let's count down 20 cartoons from the 1980s that would never air today. The Noids, 1986. Before mascots became internet memes, Domino's Pizza tried turning its infamous gremlin-like mascot, the Noid, into a cartoon. Designed as a villain who ruined pizzas, the concept was essentially corporate advertising disguised as children's entertainment. The Noid was everywhere in the mid-80s, featured in commercials, video games, and proposed animated specials. The idea of giving him his own series was pushed, but network concerns over its blatant promotional nature ultimately killed it before it could take off. What makes the Noids unairable today is how obviously it blurred the line between entertainment and marketing. Children's television has long been criticized for promoting toys and junk food, and a full series devoted to a pizza mascot would immediately raise alarms with parents and regulators. Even in its time, the concept was widely mocked for prioritizing product sales over storytelling. Adding to its bizarre legacy, the Noid's catchphrase, "Avoid the Noid," became an ironic cultural joke, remembered more for its odd marketing than for any meaningful cartoon contribution. In a modern era of tighter advertising rules and heightened scrutiny over what children consume, a cartoon like this would be seen as an unacceptable form of corporate manipulation. The Noid lives on as a nostalgic marketing relic, but the cartoon concept remains buried, a strange reminder of when companies pushed the limits of kid-friendly programming. Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, late 80s episodes. Though Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids originally launched in the 1970s, it ran into the mid-1880s with episodes that pushed boundaries too far for children's television. Its creator envisioned it as an educational program teaching morality, empathy, and life lessons. And while many episodes did just that, the later years featured increasingly heavy subject matter: crime, drug abuse, racism, and even prison life. By the late 80s, the show's once beloved Brown Hornet side segments had been replaced by grittier, reality-driven storylines. Characters found themselves navigating the dangers of urban life in ways that were uncomfortably close to real-world struggles. Some episodes depicted death, criminal activity, and substance use in stark ways. While the intention was educational, critics argued it veered into territory too dark and heavy for Saturday morning viewers. Today, this series would almost certainly face content warnings or be restructured entirely for older audiences. Children's networks have shifted away from programming that exposes kids to harsh realities without buffering the tone. Though remembered fondly for its positive intentions, the later Fat Albert episodes illustrate how far television experimented with pushing children into confronting society's ugliest truths. It may have been groundbreaking, but its rawness is precisely why it would never air today. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, syndicated in 1980s reruns. Although originally from 1974, Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch lived on in syndication through the 1980s and was marketed alongside newer shows. This Hanna-Barbera oddity centered on Wheelie, a heroic talking car constantly harassed by a gang of anthropomorphic motorcycles. The show was essentially slapstick comedy built around chase sequences, rivalries, and cartoonish violence. The problem lies in its portrayal of the biker gang. The Chopper Bunch embodied exaggerated, delinquent stereotypes, loud, destructive, and constantly scheming. By the time 1980s reruns aired, parents' groups criticized the show for glorifying bullying while also demonizing motorcyclists as inherently criminal. The tone was light-hearted, but the stereotypes fed into broader cultural fears about gangs and biker culture. Modern audiences would likely find its depiction of motorcyclists outdated, insensitive, and unnecessarily fear-driven. Furthermore, its reliance on physical gags and constant harassment would be scrutinized as promoting bullying behavior rather than condemning it. What was once dismissed as harmless cartoon mischief would now raise questions about the influence of negative stereotypes on young viewers. Forgotten by many, Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch remains a relic of when cartoon villains were broad caricatures, something that would never pass standards today. Ulysses 31, 1981. This French-Japanese co-production reimagined the Greek myth of Ulysses as a futuristic space opera. Aboard his ship, the Odyssey, Ulysses wandered through galaxies while cursed by the gods. The animation was striking, blending anime styles with European sensibilities, and it won cult admiration. Yet, despite its creativity, Ulysses 31 was dark, sometimes unsettlingly so for children's programming. Episodes featured themes of isolation, punishment by divine forces, and constant battles with grotesque alien creatures. The tone carried a coldness more in line with adult science fiction than Saturday morning fun. While educational in a mythological sense, it was heavily laden with violence, cosmic despair, and religious overtones. Ulysses himself often faced challenges with little comic relief to balance the tension. In today's landscape, networks would likely consider the mythological punishment, tragic storylines, and heavy philosophical undertones too intense for younger audiences. Some of its darker visuals, including eerie deaths of supporting characters and apocalyptic backdrops, could trigger parental backlash. Admired by adult animation fans, Ulysses 31 is both a forgotten gem and an example of how experimental 1980s cartoons sometimes ventured too far into unsettling territory. BraveStarr, 1987. Set in the futuristic, Western-inspired world of New Texas, BraveStarr was one of Filmation's last big productions. It followed Marshall BraveStarr, a Native American lawman gifted with spirit powers like the eyes of the hawk and ears of the wolf. While the premise sounded progressive, the execution leaned heavily on stereotypes that would make it unairable today. The cartoon attempted to address issues like drug abuse, greed, and lawlessness, often with moral lesson-of-the-day segments. However, critics quickly pointed out its shallow representation of Native culture with powers and tribal elements reduced to clichés. Additionally, the villains were violent and grotesque, with guns, gang fights, and frequent shootouts taking center stage. Its most infamous episode, The Price, tackled drug addiction head-on, showing a young character overdosing and dying, something unheard of in children's television. While praised by some educators, others condemned it as traumatizing for kids. The show was part toy promotion, part morality tale, and part science fiction western, making it a strange hybrid that never fully satisfied any audience. Today, BraveStarr would face sharp criticism for its cultural appropriation, heavy-handed messaging, and violent tone. Its ambition is undeniable, but its flaws ensure it remains a fascinating yet forgotten experiment in 1980s animation history. Willow the Wisp, 1981, syndicated in the 80s. At first glance, Willow the Wisp seemed like harmless whimsy, a surreal British import that aired during the early 1980s in the U.S. The show featured an eccentric narrator, voiced by actor Kenneth Williams, guiding viewers through the adventures of bizarre forest creatures. Among them were Evil Edna, a witch shaped like a television set, and a cast of oddball supporting characters that felt more like abstract concepts than kid-friendly mascots. While Willow the Wisp gained cult admiration, its dark humor and surreal undertones made it an uneasy fit for children. Williams's delivery was wry, often sarcastic, filled with double meanings that went over children's heads but carried strange undertones for adults. Evil Edna, in particular, embodied themes of media manipulation, her television screen head casting spells that controlled others, an eerie metaphor few kids fully grasped. By modern standards, its cynical humor and unsettling imagery would raise questions about appropriateness for children. While adults might appreciate its satire, parents would be uncomfortable with the way the show mixed childlike visuals with darker commentary. In an era where children's programming is carefully curated for positivity and inclusivity, Willow the Wisp would be viewed as too subversive, too odd, and ultimately too unsettling to air. It stands as an example of how surrealist cartoons could straddle the line between kids' programming and biting social commentary, something networks would never greenlight today. Mysterious Cities of Gold, 1982. This French-Japanese collaboration fascinated a generation with its epic scope. Mysterious Cities of Gold followed Esteban, Zia, and Tao as they searched for ancient golden cities in the New World, guided by historical myth and pursued by dangerous enemies. The series combined adventure storytelling with educational interludes, often teaching viewers about South American history, geography, and culture. Despite its noble aims, the show carried an unusually heavy tone. Episodes depicted colonialism, betrayal, and the harsh realities of conquest. Characters sometimes faced near-death experiences with visuals of despair and destruction that felt closer to an adult drama than a Saturday morning cartoon. While many fans now praise its ambition, at the time it was considered too slow and somber for younger audiences. In today's context, critics would likely highlight the way it portrayed indigenous people and colonial explorers through a Eurocentric lens. The narrative often walked a fine line between honoring native cultures and romanticizing conquest, something far more heavily scrutinized today. Additionally, its haunting score and mature pacing would make it a tough sell in a world dominated by bright, fast-paced animation. Forgotten by mainstream audiences, Mysterious Cities of Gold remains beloved among enthusiasts of historical animation. But in today's media landscape, its blend of heavy themes and outdated cultural framing would make it unlikely to return to children's television. Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats, 1984. While Garfield was charming audiences with lazy sarcasm, Heathcliff tried to stake his claim as the original street-smart feline. The 1980 series Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats followed the orange tabby as he caused chaos in his neighborhood, often clashing with rival cats and dogs while pulling elaborate scams. The second segment, the Cadillac Cats, introduced an eccentric gang led by Riff Raff, who lived in a junkyard and schemed for food, fun, and attention. Unlike Garfield's relatively tame antics, Heathcliff's humor was more violent, mischievous, and occasionally mean-spirited. From tossing rivals in trash cans to elaborate cons, Heathcliff embodied a kind of anarchic energy that clashed with shifting norms for children's programming. Today, networks would balk at the street gang undertones of the Cadillac Cats and the constant use of physical comedy that bordered on cruelty. The glorification of hustler lifestyles, territorial brawls, and manipulation would be flagged for bad influence. While it entertained its generation, the humor feels outdated in a world where bullying and aggressive behavior are carefully filtered out of kids' shows. Ultimately, Heathcliff has been overshadowed by Garfield, who continues to thrive. The Cadillac Cats are now remembered only by nostalgic fans, a forgotten gang of animated misfits that television today would never embrace. Richie Rich, 1980 to 1984. Based on the Harvey Comics character, Richie Rich presented the world through the eyes of the poor little rich boy. In the cartoon, Richie was a kind-hearted billionaire child who used his fortune to fund adventures, solve mysteries, and invent gadgets. Alongside his loyal dog Dollar and faithful butler Cadbury, Richie lived in a fantasy of unlimited wealth. Though light-hearted, the cartoon was entirely built on materialism. Richie's problems were solved with expensive solutions, often showcasing his endless toys, vehicles, and inventions. In the 1980s, at the height of consumer culture, this came across as aspirational. But today, the optics of glorifying a billionaire child as a role model would be difficult to justify. Contemporary critics point out how tone-deaf it feels in a world where economic disparity and wealth inequality are pressing issues. Richie's adventures, meant to be playful, now read as an indulgence in wealth fantasy that alienates more than it entertains. Parents would likely complain that the show promotes consumerism rather than values like empathy, hard work, or resilience. While fondly remembered by some as a harmless cartoon fantasy, Richie Rich has not aged well. Its exaggerated celebration of wealth ensures it remains a relic of a decade obsessed with excess, and one that would not find a place on children's TV today. Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, 1985. During the height of professional wrestling's pop culture explosion, CBS launched Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. The show featured animated versions of wrestling superstars like Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, and Rowdy Roddy Piper, placed into outlandish adventures filled with slapstick antics. Wrestlers even appeared in live-action segments to connect the cartoon to real-world WWF events. At the time, it was considered a bold tie-in, blending sports entertainment with Saturday morning television. But behind the colorful action was a program that functioned as little more than an advertisement for professional wrestling. The show leaned heavily on stereotypes, turning wrestlers into caricatures. Hogan as the noble all-American hero, Piper as the scheming villain, and others reduced to broad personality quirks. In retrospect, it's clear how much the cartoon pushed promotional boundaries. Wrestling was notoriously violent, controversial, and adult-oriented, yet the show attempted to sanitize it for children without addressing its rougher realities. Parents questioned why kids were encouraged to idolize figures known for chair-smashing fights and over-the-top aggression. Today, such a show would almost certainly face criticism for being blatant marketing to children, filled with questionable role models. Its reliance on exaggerated stereotypes and its thinly veiled promotional angle would keep it far from modern broadcast approval. Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling remains a fascinating time capsule, an animated marketing experiment that would never survive in today's TV climate. Macron 1, 1986. Macron 1 was an American adaptation of two different Japanese anime series, Go Shogun and Aku Daisakusen Srungle. Producers stitched together storylines, rewrote plots, and dubbed over the characters, creating a hybrid mecha series that aired briefly in syndication. The result was a confusing but visually stunning show where giant robots fought epic battles while young pilots navigated moral dilemmas. While anime fans later appreciated its design and bold action sequences, Macron 1 bewildered casual viewers. The narrative didn't flow smoothly, and themes like war, loss, and betrayal slipped into what was meant to be kids' entertainment. Many episodes showed bleak depictions of futuristic destruction, with human characters enduring suffering uncommon for Saturday morning shows. Parents voiced concerns about its violence and emotional weight, while critics noted that the U.S. edits stripped away cultural nuance, leaving behind a jumbled product. In an era when cartoons were scrutinized for toy-driven motives, Macron 1 appeared both too dark and too incoherent for children. Today, a cartoon like Macron 1 would never air without heavy modification. Its grim battles, moral ambiguity, and disturbing visuals would push it firmly into older audience anime. While a cult favorite among fans of 1980s mecha, its complicated production and darker tone ensured it faded into obscurity. Forgotten by most, but remembered as one of the strangest animated imports of its era. Gobots, 1984. Launched by Tonka to rival Transformers, Challenge of the Gobots introduced a world where heroic guardians battled the evil renegades. At its heart, it was a toy commercial disguised as a cartoon, with characters transforming into cars, planes, and helicopters. While it built a loyal fan base, Gobots quickly earned the reputation of being the knockoff Transformers. The problem wasn't just competition, it was presentation. The animation was stiff, the stories predictable, and the character personalities shallow. Critics at the time noted that it was blatant merchandising, offering children a cheaper alternative to Hasbro's Transformers toys. Episodes often featured repetitive battles with little moral depth, relying instead on promoting the latest toy in the line. Modern standards of children's programming would never allow such obvious commercial intent. Today, shows must balance storytelling with branding. Gobots was unabashedly an extended advertisement. Furthermore, its gender portrayals were outdated, with few female characters and heavily stereotypical roles. Despite its shortcomings, Gobots holds nostalgic value for those who grew up with it, remembered more as a cultural footnote than a lasting legacy. Overshadowed by the enduring popularity of Transformers, it represents a forgotten chapter in 1980s animation that television today would reject for being too derivative and too commercial. Blackstar, 1981. Created by Filmation, Blackstar followed astronaut John Blackstar, who crash-landed on the planet Sager and found himself caught in a battle between good and evil. Armed with the powerful Star Sword, he faced the villain Overlord and led a resistance alongside allies like the Trobots, small creatures clearly inspired by the Smurfs. Visually, Blackstar was ambitious, blending science fiction and fantasy long before such hybrids became mainstream. Its landscapes were dark and eerie, populated by grotesque villains and intense battles. But this ambition also made it unsettling. Children were exposed to frightening imagery, endless combat, and themes of enslavement and domination. While He-Man later toned down this formula for broader audiences, Blackstar was far bleaker. Parents raised concerns about its violent undertones and its dark atmosphere, which contrasted sharply with lighter Saturday morning fare. Its villains were genuinely frightening, and story arcs leaned into heavy themes like oppression and war. For young children, it was a disturbing experience rather than escapist entertainment. In today's environment, Blackstar would likely be deemed inappropriate for children, reserved instead for older animation fans. Its heavy reliance on sword fights, dark fantasy aesthetics, and constant peril makes it a forgotten series that couldn't possibly air for kids now. Yet for those who remember it, Blackstar remains a fascinating precursor to more mainstream fantasy cartoons of the decade. Kissifur, 1986. Kissifur told the story of a father bear and his cub who escaped the circus and tried to build a life in the swamps of Paddlecab County. While the premise seemed sweet, the execution was peculiar, mixing elements of drama, slapstick, and swamp-dwelling stereotypes. Supporting characters like Miss Emmy Lou, the swamp school teacher, and the bumbling alligator villains added to the show's quirky tone. What made Kissifur unusual was its darker backstory, a family escaping from human captivity. Though framed as child-friendly adventure, the underlying trauma gave the series an unsettling quality. Episodes sometimes touched on abandonment, loss, and survival, wrapped in comedic packaging that didn't quite match the seriousness of its themes. Today, such a cartoon would face heavy scrutiny. Its swamp caricatures would be considered insensitive, while the premise of runaway circus animals trying to build a new life might be seen as too emotionally heavy for kids. The bumbling villains also relied on stereotypes of rural ignorance, which haven't aged well. While it had a brief fan base in the 1980s, Kissifur has largely disappeared from cultural memory. Its combination of oddball, characters, heavy undertones, and uncomfortable humor ensures it remains a forgotten oddity, one that children's networks today would never approve. Puppies, 1986. Based on the popular toy line, Puppies was designed to tug at kids' hearts. The cartoon followed a group of stray dogs living in a pound, waiting to be adopted while embarking on adventures to help children and animals in need. On the surface, it was heartwarming, but beneath that cuteness lay a show soaked in melancholy. Each episode revolved around abandonment, loneliness, and the hope of finding a home. While these themes were relatable, they also made the show emotionally heavy for young children. The idea of lovable dogs trapped in cages, constantly longing for adoption, was more depressing than entertaining. Even when episodes ended happily, the central premise was one of sadness. Parents raised concerns that it introduced children to themes of rejection and loss without providing enough balance. In addition, critics pointed out that the cartoon was little more than a marketing tool to sell plush toys, creating an odd mix of emotional manipulation and commercialism. In a modern era of positive, empowering children's content, Pound Puppies would be seen as exploitative, using children's compassion to drive toy sales. Though some remember it fondly, the emotional weight and overt branding make it unlikely to ever return to screens today. Wuzzles, 1985. Disney's Wuzzles was one of the first cartoons directly tied to a toy line, premiering alongside Hasbro's merchandise push. Each character was a hybrid of two animals, like Bumble Lion, a bumblebee lion, or Ellaroo, an elephant kangaroo. On paper, it was a colorful, imaginative world. But in practice, the show leaned heavily into product promotion and became an early example of toy-driven storytelling. The cuteness of Wuzzles couldn't mask its corporate origins. The show felt more like an extended commercial than a piece of entertainment, designed to sell plush toys rather than tell meaningful stories. While children enjoyed the bright designs, adults quickly noticed its thin plots and one-dimensional characters. It lasted just one season before fading into obscurity. Today, a show like Wuzzles would be heavily criticized for its blatant consumerism. Modern regulations restrict cartoons from functioning as direct toy advertisements, and parents are more attuned to manipulative marketing. Furthermore, its simplistic humor and shallow messages wouldn't hold up in a media landscape where even preschool shows prioritize lessons in empathy, diversity, and problem-solving. Though fondly remembered by some for its catchy theme song and odd character mashups, Wuzzles ultimately represents a forgotten experiment in mixing toys and television. It's unlikely any network would greenlight such an obvious commercial project today. The Snorks, 1984. The Snorks were Hanna-Barbera's attempt to replicate the success of the Smurfs, only underwater. With their colorful bodies and snorkel-like tubes on their heads, the Snorks lived in a whimsical sea world, engaging in adventures and moral lessons. Despite its creativity, the show never captured the same magic as its forest-dwelling inspiration. The problem wasn't just derivative storytelling, it was tone. Episodes often relied on slapstick humor and shallow conflicts, leaving little depth beyond their visual gimmick. While the underwater setting provided novelty, the characters were forgettable, and the show quickly fell into the shadow of the Smurfs. Critics labeled it a weaker copycat, and audiences eventually agreed. Today, a cartoon so transparently modeled after a hit would be dismissed as unoriginal. Modern children's television places high value on innovation, diversity, and rich storytelling. The Snorks, with its lack of complexity and overly commercial nature, would feel like an unnecessary imitation. Though it ran for 4 seasons, the show has all but disappeared from pop culture, remembered only by nostalgia enthusiasts. Its fate shows how derivative cartoons of the 1980s often got buried, and why something so uninspired would never see airtime now. Mighty Mouse, The New Adventures, 1987. Ralph Bakshi, known for pushing boundaries in animation, revived Mighty Mouse with The New Adventures. At first, it was celebrated for its zany, surreal humor and wild, imaginative sequences that felt like a parody of traditional superhero cartoons. But controversy soon erupted that permanently damaged the show's reputation. The biggest storm came from a scene in which Mighty Mouse sniffed a crushed flower. Some conservative groups interpreted this as a metaphor for drug use, accusing the show of promoting harmful behavior. Despite Bakshi's denials, the backlash was fierce, sparking national outrage and forcing CBS to censor the cartoon. Beyond the scandal, the show's frenetic pace and adult-oriented satire made it difficult for young children to follow. The humor was often dark, filled with double meanings, and aimed more at ironic adults than its supposed audience. While ahead of its time artistically, it was too chaotic and controversial to survive in mainstream Saturday morning programming. In today's cautious climate, such a series would be swiftly pulled from children's schedules. Its surrealism and edgy jokes might thrive on adult platforms, but as a kids' show, it simply doesn't fit. Mighty Mouse may remain a cultural icon, but his late 80s revival is a forgotten chapter networks wouldn't dare repeat. Garbage Pail Kids, 1987. Few cartoons were as infamous as Garbage Pail Kids. Based on the wildly popular but controversial trading cards, the series featured grotesque characters with names like Messy Tessie and Foul Phil, each defined by a repulsive trait. Intended as a parody of Cabbage Patch Kids, it leaned into gross-out humor that parents quickly deemed offensive and inappropriate. CBS initially planned to air the series in 1987, but public outrage stopped it in its tracks. Parent groups, child psychologists, and watchdog organizations condemned the show for glorifying disgusting behavior and encouraging mockery of others' appearances. The backlash was so intense that the series was pulled from the U.S. schedule before it even aired, though it did run in some international markets. The controversy itself sealed its fate. Critics argued it normalized bullying and made a joke out of deformities and suffering. While the cards became cult collectibles, the cartoon was seen as crossing a moral line for children's programming. In today's world of sensitivity to bullying, body shaming, and mental health, Garbage Pail Kids would be utterly unthinkable as a children's show. Its grotesque humor and mean-spirited tone would guarantee instant cancellation. Once considered shocking, it now survives only as a strange footnote in 1980s pop culture. Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more hidden pop culture history.